Good morning, Rabbi Isai. Lilu nishma simi merosirus bas Mordechai. Says the Mishnah. Nitmas achas menachalois. Here we go. Check this out. We're starting off with a piece of art. We know that there's 12 lechem aponims. There's 2 rows. There's 2 zdarim. Each seder, each row contains 6 chalois. And we also have 2 spoonfuls of levina. And come the chaver kedisha of the mice. They walk by, they have a dead mouse on the stretcher, and the dead mouse touches 1. What happens to the second row of breads? Since they weren't touched, perhaps they're not tummy. One of the chalas, or a whole row of it. Rabbi Yehuda, we must burn all the chalas. We consider all 12 of them tamei, and therefore you should take them out to the place where we burn stuff. There's 2 places. There's one inside the Beis Hamikdash. I'm going to show you the one that's outside. According to some Rishonim, we burn it inside because it became tamei inside. The point is, there's a pile of stuff that we burn. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you touch one, you touch them all. Shein karban tzibur chalok, at the end we're going to say, because at the end of the day, we cannot divide up the carbon. They're all considered one entity, one guf, one kedusha, I guess. So if you touch one bread, all 12 become tamei. And Chacham argue, they say that the row of challah that the mouse touched, that you're right, but the other row, not. You know, this is Rabbi Yehuda, all 12, they say no. The dead mouse touched the left row, the left is tamei, the right is tar. So when we're talking about the chalois, the lechem aponim, so we have the bazichim that go on the mizbeach. In other words, when we're talking about, we're going to be discussing the 2 breads on Shavuos that come together with the 2 shlamim. So over there you have Zrikas Adam, you have the matter, you have what allows you to eat the bread. Burning the bazichin of the lechem aponim allows you to eat the lechem aponim. Burning or doing Zrikas Adam with the blood of the shlamim allows you to eat the 2 breads of Shavuos. So says Rabbi Lazar, we have a machlokes before the matter happened, before you did Zrikas Adam, before you were makriv the frankincense, the levina of the bezichim onto the mizbeach when it comes to lechem aponim. But once you locked it in with the matir, the reakol atomim tumasiv atar yochel, it's, as you see on the screen, whatever you touched is tamei, whatever you didn't touch remains tar. So what would be the machlokes then if there is no zrika? The Gemara is going to take this back, but for now, the Gemara says that the machlokes is, how do we view the tzitz? We know that the tzitz is one of the clothing that the Kohen Gadol wears on his forehead. It says kodesh l'Hashem. Different machlokes how we do it, but it has powers to remove the concern of tumah that we might have. The question is, once you have this tzitz, can you even eat something that has an issue with tumah? That what? Rabbanan savriya tzitz miratza ala chilos. So says Rashi that the zrika accomplishes, but you're not allowed to eat the bread. It's a good zrika. That's what the tzitz does, that even though there was tumah, but there was a good zrika. In other words, the carbon is a good carbon. But to eat the bread, that you cannot do. Why? Because, check it out, there's a mafurish passage that says, once there's food that became tamei, there's a carbon that became tamei, you're not allowed to eat it. Okay. So Rabbanan hold the tzitz is good, and it makes the carbon good. The tzitz cannot accomplish anything, and you're not allowed to eat any of the breads, even though you're allowed to be makriv because tumah hutri b'tzibur. Okay. Things that go onto the mizbeach, like blood, like the kmitz that go onto the mizbeach, that's it. You're not supposed to put it on the mizbeach if it's tumah, but if you put it on, the tzitz gives it a kapara. Upligi, and there's machlokes nevertheless, even in that case. If one of the two spoons became tamei, here, check it out, another case. We have the Chaver Kedisha, mouse Chaver Kedisha walk by. And the person somehow extends his hand and touches one of the spoons. So one is tamei, the other not. What's the halacha? They're both considered tamei, but you continue going on. The tzitz is miratza for it. Why? Because we don't separate these items. If you touch one, you touch them all. It's as if you touch them all. No, the one that's red, the one that's tamei remains tamei. The one that's tar is tar. Void. Another question. When it comes to Korban Pesach and one of the Shvatim, you have 12 Shvatim, let's say Reuven, all of Shevet Reuven is Tameh. So now somebody from Shevet Shimon is Tameh. Can he handle the carbon? All of Shevet Reuven can handle the carbon because Tumah Hudra B'tzibur, if there's a large, the majority of one Shevet is Tameh, it's Hutar. What about the rest of the Shvatim? So the answer is yes. They could all do it in Tumah. Why? Because when it comes to the karbanos of the tzibur, we don't divide them, we don't split them up. So if one shevet is kosher to do it, even betumah, so all shvatim are, because we cannot break up any of the shvatim. And as the Gemara, what does that have to do with the machlokes regarding the tzitz, like Rav Papa wanted to discuss? This has nothing to do with the tzitz. What does this? This has nothing to do with tzitz. This has just to do with whether or not we the tzibur's chaluk. That's the lashon in the Mishnah of she'ein karban tzibur chaluk. We don't split up the karbanos. We don't split up the shvatim. That's the idea. One more question. Going back to this, if one row of challah, whoa, how did that happen? One row of challah became tamei. I was saying before it was the left one, now it's just the right one. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. They're both considered. It's just maybe because I have to start here. Now it's going to be the left. So cute. Boom. The halacha is that they're both tamei. You send them both to get burned. And it says, because we don't split them up. If you touch one pile, it's as if you touched all piles. You divide them up. If it's true, you're saying that it depends. The machlokes is about a tzitz. You should have said, you should explain that has to do with the tzitz. No, he got this with tradition from his Rebbe and his Rebbe from his Rebbe. That if you cannot break things up. So if what part of the pile, one bread even becomes tamei, it's as if all the bread became tamei. Says the Mishnah, so that's our taida. When a person has a thought of pigul that he's going to eat this taida tomorrow instead of today, you're only allowed to eat it today, and his thought is to eat it tomorrow. So that automatically does pigul to all the breads. But if the thought was on the breads, then it doesn't transfer that isser of pigul to the animal. The bread does not cause pigul to the animal. Keitzad, What's the case? He shechs the toida, thinking in his brain that he's going to eat it outside the allotted time. In other words, tomorrow, he's not going to eat it today, he's going to eat it when he's not allowed to eat it tomorrow. He v'halechem fugalim, both the animal and the bread become pigul, and if you eat from it, you're chayiv kares. Lechem and lechem l'malchar, but if his thought was on the bread, that he's going to eat the bread tomorrow, delicious bread, and he wants to eat it tomorrow, he's going on vacation, needs to bring some bread. If he wasn't thinking about the animal, it applies to the bread only, the pigul, and not to the carbon. The same halacha applies on Shavuos when you have two. As he's shechting, he's thinking of doing it in the red clock, in the place, on the animal. So since he did it on the animal, it transfers. You see how it just transfers, jumped from the animal to the bread. But if his thought is that he's going to eat the bread outside the allotted time, so it does not transfer to the animal. Look, there's actually a special invisible shield. The animal's actually laughing at you because he will not become pigul. So now that we have the case of the two breads, if you do pigul on the two sheep, then automatically the two breads become pigul. But if you reverse it and you do the pigul on the bread, it does not cause pigul to the sheep. Keitzad, what's the case? If he shechs the sheep with the intent to eat them tomorrow, that also applies, it transfers to the bread as well. But if his idea was to do it on the bread, that applies only to the bread and not to the animals. What's the reason that it transfers from the animal to the bread, but not from the bread to the animal? Now, maybe because it says in the pasuk, that the chalois is considered a toida. So you see that the bread is called a toida. So if the bread is called a toida, so if you think about from bread, it should transfer from bread to the animal. Animal and bread are the same. They're both called toida. So why can't it transfer from bread to the animal? Holy kasha. Lechem ikri toida, toida ikri lechem. It only goes one way. Bread is called a toida. So therefore, when you think about a toida, it goes to the bread. But toida ikri lechem, you don't call a toida bread. So therefore, if you think about bread, it doesn't go to the toida. So how come when it comes to the two sheep on Shavuos, it goes from the sheep to the bread, but not from the bread to the sheep? Your whole svara is because a toida bread is called a toida. You don't have that svara when it comes to Shavuos. So says Rashi, toida ikar v'lechem tafel. Glal toida means because of the toida. Bread is because of the toida. In other words, says Rashi, the toida is the main thing here. The lechem is secondary. It's a tafel. The shchita is toida mikatshel lechem. And in fact, when you shecht the toida, that gives gedusha to the bread. In other words, the bread, it comes as a, I don't know the right word. Okay, whatever. Okay, great. So therefore, says the Gemara, lechem glal toida, the bread comes because of a toida. Vein toida glal lechem, the lechem, and the toida is not secondary to the bread. Lechem glal the kvasim, vein kvasim glal the lechem. The bread on Shavuos is secondary to the kvasim. The ikar is the shechting of the two sheep. Utzriche, we need both cases of toida with the bread and the Shavuos shlamim with their bread. The Yashmin toida hasam udechim mefagel belechem lemefagel toida. Mishum lo yuzkeku zelo zebet nufa. As we're going to see in a second, as far as developing, when it comes to the Shavuos shlamim, you have to do something called a tnufa. You have to lift up the sheep together with the two breads, and you do moilech or maybe back forth, all to the sides like a lulav. So says the Gemara, they are connected, so to speak, the breads and the animal are connected because you did tnufa together. So I would think that if you do pigul on the breads, it should transfer immediately to the sheep. Why? Because they are connected you do the tnufa together. Tzricha. That's why I need both. Rebbe Lazar Mirav. Rebbe Lazar asked Rav a question. As you can see here, as he's shechting the animal, and he thinks to himself, I am going to eat tomorrow, which is outside the allotted time, after the time you're not permitted to eat any of the animal or bread. I'm going to eat a half a kezayis from the animal and a half a kezayis from the bread. Together I have one kezayis, which is the shear of pigul. Says the Gemara, I certainly cannot make the animal pigul. Why? We just established that if you do pigul 100% on the bread, it doesn't transfer to the animal. But if you do pigul on the animal, it transfers from the bread. So if you do a half a shear from the animal, a half a shear from the bread, of course it's not going to transfer from the bread to the animal. Even if you did a whole shear on the bread, it's not going to transfer to the animal. Of course it's not going to be mifagel from the bread. The question is, can the bread become pigul like this? Check this out. Can the bread become pigul through a half a zayis of the meat and a half a zayis of the bread? Can I use a half a zayis from an animal in order to make the bread pigul? Now, if I made a whole zayis in the bread, of course it's going to become pigul. But I only have a half a zayis from the bread. And a half a zayis from the animal, can I have a tziruf, can I have a combination, can I combine to make pigul? Yes, the bread will come pigul, but the animal not. I asked the Gemara, I have an interesting kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma hamefagel imispagel. The toida, which creates pigul. In other words, you take the toida, and that you have thoughts that you're going to eat the toida, the animal, outside of its allotted time. So it creates pigul to the bread. Uma hamefagel imispagel. It cannot become pigul through the bread. Habal fagel, this bread that you're trying to make pigul, v'loi pigel and pagel. So you're trying to take a half a zayis of bread together with the half a zayis of the animal. Of course, it shouldn't become pigul. What's the kavachomer? The toida is much stronger than the bread. Toida has the power to make the bread pigul. Yet, it itself cannot become pigul through the bread. So the bread, which is weak, certainly it should not become pigul with a half a shear of the animal. Says Gemara, this kavachem doesn't usually work. But Tanya, we had a story. We know that it's also to plant in a vineyard. Midaraisa, it's wheat, as we're going to see soon, luf, a couple of things. This is midaraisa. You're not allowed to plant in your vineyard other things. What they're doing right now, sowing wheat, is mamish is midaraisa. Comes a guy, a random person, and decides to utilize the space between the vines for himself. And he plants. And we have a concept in Shas, Ein Adam Oiser Dover Shein Shaloi. You cannot ask for something that doesn't belong to you. Now, it doesn't always apply. But in this case, it does. Why? Because it's D'Rabbanan. And it's not just the D'Rabbanan, it's a penalty of D'Rabbanan. So it says the story came in from the Chachamim, and they said that everything you planted becomes osur, but all the vines are 100% motor. Say exact kavachem as you just said now. The grapes that they cause isser, they themselves didn't become osur. Habola esor, so certainly what you planted, these different seeds that you planted, they didn't create an isser to the grapes. And it didn't. Certainly they themselves shouldn't become osur. Says Gemara, so why? Don't bring me right from here. Hasam kambus v'luv asur Torah. The Torah asserted cannabis. I don't know if it means what they call today cannabis, something similar from the same family, or hemp. That's what the Torah asserted. Chazarah in the Rabbanon Asiri, but everything else is only in the Rabbanon. Hi, David Isur Rabbanon. This guy that planted where he wasn't supposed to be planting, Rabbanon punished him. Hi, the David Isur like it's a Rabbanon. But the guy that owns the vineyard, Rabbanon did not penalize him. But by us, why can't you say Kavachomer? Now we're going to go really quick because word for word what we just said, it's Chazarah. Just instead of talking about the Taida, we're going to be talking about the two sheep on Shavuos. Rav, same words, over. Rabbi Elazar asked Rav, somebody shechted the sheep in order to eat a kazayis, a total kazayis. Half a kazayis from the sheep and half a kazayis from the bread, ma'u. Certainly you cannot make the sheep pigul. If you had in mind while you're doing a whole kazayis from bread onto the sheep, it doesn't work. Certainly, if it's only half from the bread and half from it, it's not going to work. But the question is, can I use the half from? Just take this chart and pretend it's on Shavuos. Can I take a half from the sheep and half from the bread and make the breads also? Can I combine the sheep, the meat, the half kazayis together with the bread? Over here also we'll say the bread becomes pigul, but not the sheep. We should say the same we said before. The sheep who are the ones that do pigul, they themselves don't become pigul. So certainly the bread that is coming to become pigul and it didn't become pigul certainly shouldn't make the strong guy, the sheep, pigul. As do I say such a thing? But how you had a story? Somebody planted in a blooming vineyard, planted some seeds, and over there we said that he gets punished, but the owner of the vineyard does not. You should say the same you just said. The grapes don't become asur. So the seedlings in the center, they're coming to answer the grapes. Certainly, they themselves should not become asur. But what's the connection? The Torah, there's only a few things that you're not allowed to plant with their eyes. But other seeds are only with the Rabbanon. So the person who planted, he did the Isser, he gets punished. But the owner of the vineyard doesn't get punished, he didn't do anything. Like it's the Rabbanon. But by us, perhaps we should say the Kalchaim. Says Gemara, if you say this svara when it comes to the carbon taida, so certainly on the sheep of Shavuos. The Gemara is going to explain. It's only because by the sheep of Shavuos, there's a tnufa like Avi Kamiansky did. He raised, lift, this, that, together with the bread. So now we just tie the breads together with the animal, and that's why they're one, perhaps, and that's why they're connected. And that's why if you do I said that's why 6 times. That's why if you think about pigul on the breads, maybe it transfers to the sheep because they're one. I would say such a thing. Rabbi Abizud said the question is like this. Rabbi Elazar asked Rav something else. If he shechs a sheep, now we're talking about the two sheep. Okay, these two guys on Shavuos, and he shechs a sheep to eat a kazayis from its friend tomorrow. Now, what in the world is a friend? We know that on Shavuos you have to shech both sheep in order to eat the bread, so each one is a 50% matter. Each one allows you to eat the bread, but only in a 50% capacity. When I say friend, do I mean, I'm looking at this guy, the friend, I'm shechting shlamim on the right, his friend is on the left. Or perhaps his friend is referring to the bread. Since either I hold that in Fagel Chatzi Matir I can't do pigul on half, or I hold You could, but it's not enough over here. Chaver kevesh mashma b'li mefagel. Oy dilma lechem mashma mefagel. Perhaps I was referring to the bread, and it becomes pigel. So we learned if I shechted one of the sheep in order to eat from itself tomorrow, in other words, the sheep are not connected, and therefore if I make pigul on one, it doesn't apply to the other. But it says mefurish, and over here it says the word friend, and it's referring to, guess what? The sheep, not the bread. So that's a raya that we're talking about sheep and not bread. Shneim ksherim, the both kosher. Alma, what do we see from here? Chaver keves mashma. When I say the word friend, I mean the other sheep. Because if I'm talking about the bread would become pigul. Says Gemara, Dilmu defarish v'ama chaver keves is not a good raya because maybe over here we're talking about a situation where he actually says not just the word friend, but he says friend sheep. Says the Mishnah, Hazevach mefagel es anasachim shekosher b'kli. There are two korbanos, the oil and the shlamim, where in addition to the actual carbon, you bring a bunch of wine. Now let's talk about the shlamim. Shlamim is easier to understand because shlamim, you get to eat the actual animal. It's a kachim kalim. You get to eat it. Oila, as we know, kulei l'Hashem, it all goes in the mizbeach. So hazevach mefagel es hanasachim mishakash b'kli. The remeir. Once you pour the wine into the vessel, so it becomes kadosh. And when I think a bad intent, I think while I'm shechting this shlamim that I'm going to eat the shlamim in 3 days from now instead of 2 days, I could do pigul. This wine in the cup becomes pigul. But if my intent was on the wine, I'm saying this wine should become pigul. That doesn't have an effect on the animal. Ketzad, what's the case? I'm shechting this shlamim to eat it tomorrow. Now, it could also be referring to the oila. I say I'm going to put the oila on the mizbeach tomorrow. It itself. Let's talk about the shlamim. The shlamim itself, the animal itself becomes pigul. So too does the wine become pigul. But if I say I'm going to put the wine tomorrow on the mizbeach, I'm going to do it later than I'm allowed to. So that actually creates pigul to the actual wine. And if I drink the wine, I'm over on chorus. But it has no effect on the shlamim because you cannot transfer the isur pigul from the wine to the shlamim. You could transfer from the shlamim to the wine. The wines you chayav pigul because there's something that has in order for something to become pigul, it has to have a matter that we discussed yesterday. So the shirayim, all this leftover flour from the kmitza becomes pigul. Why? Because this small amount of kmitza goes on the mizbeach. This is the matter. This is the allower for me to eat this. The same thing when it comes to a carbon. When I sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, that allows me to eat the shlamim. At that moment, I'm allowed to eat the shlamim, not a moment before. So shlamim has a matter. Shlamim, I can eat. A carbon has a matter. The wine also has a matter. When I sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, then I'm allowed to put the wine on the mizbeach. It seems like there's no connection between the carbon animal and the wine. Why? Because I could bring the carbon today, and I could bring the wine in 10 days from now, in 20 days from now, in 2 years from now. There's no limit to when I could bring the wine. So they're not connected. If they're not connected, I can't make pigul from one to the other. You're right. But in a situation where I do bring the wine today together with the carbon. Says Gemara, but at the last moment, I could switch it from animal A to animal B, and therefore they're not connected. Once I shech this animal, then this wine is appointed to this animal. I can't change it to another animal. We're going to do the same exact thing all over again. Chazarah to the bottom of the amud, and then we stop. Like shemen, the amount of lug, a lug of oil, shel mitzayra. So let's see if we have an updated version. I know that Yoshi wanted to. This is Nesachim, by the way. Pouring the wine on the mizbeach into the shitin. Let's see. No. This is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it's the wrong side of the thumb. It's supposed to be on the nail part. But anyways, just to remind the Olam, you're supposed to smear oil on top of the blood and on his toe and his thumb and on his head, on his ear. And the rest goes on his head. So, if the Kohen taught himself that he's going to use this oil, in another day from now, Yechayev Pigul. Now, we'll see. That's not really the case. It's more with the carbon. Because the blood of the asham that the mitzvah brings allows you to apply the oil on his thumbs, on his thumb and on his large toe. What's the connection between the carbon and the oil? The oil can be brought 10 days from now, 100 days from now. I'm referring to oil that comes together that day with the asham. But you can put it and designate it to another carbon. Because Rameir holds, once you shech this asham, then the oil becomes locked in, just like the breads of a taida that become locked into that particular taida, and therefore you can't change it, and therefore they are one. If they're one unit, one has hashpa on the other. So if I do pigul on the asham, it has an effect on the oil as well. Boisai, have a wonderful day.
Merit the schus of spreading Torah throughout the world. Sponsor a shir today. MDYsponsor.com or sponsor at MDY.com.